Good morning, guys. I'm out here in my garden today getting a little bit of work done. I love to work in the garden. I love this time of year when you can get out and get your hands dirty, and then in a few months you can pick juicy red tomatoes right out of your garden, or you could eat that sweet corn on the cob. Or maybe you have some different things that you like to eat. Maybe your family has a garden and you like to go out and help work in the garden, and you like to eat the food from your garden. My favorite thing in the garden is peanuts. I love to do peanuts, and then in the fall, I love to pick those peanuts, boil them all day, and eat them when I watch football. I love to get out and work in the garden, but you know there's one thing when you get in the garden, your hands get a little dirty. Can you see that? Because you've got to get your hands down into the dirt. You've got to use soil or compost or different things to mix in there to give those roots some really good stuff for them to suck up and to eat so that the plants can grow. If you want to have a good garden, you've got to get your hands dirty. If you don't want dirty hands, you're probably not going to be able to eat those tomatoes or peanuts or corn on the cob or those other things that we get from our garden. You know, the reason I show you my dirty hands and talk about that is Jesus told a story, one of his parables. In the Bible, it's in Luke chapter 10. We call it the parable of the Good Samaritan. In this story, Jesus says that there was a man who was going on a journey, and along the way, some robbers, some thieves jumped out from their hiding spot, and they beat this guy up, and they took his money, they even took his clothes, they took everything they could get from him, and they left this guy on the side of the road, and they took off. But the good news is, here comes a priest. Now, in their day, a priest was kind of like we might think of the pastor of the church. And this would be good news. If anybody's going to help this poor guy, it would be the priest, right? His whole job was to help people. And he knew the law, what we consider the Old Testament. It said that you were supposed to help people that were in need, that you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. Did that priest help the man? No. You know what he did? He walked around the guy so that he didn't have to touch him. And as the man lay there, a few minutes later, Jesus said, well, here comes someone else. He is a Levite. Levites were kind of like priests, but they worked in the temple. They helped out the priests. They just weren't quite the same thing as priests. But the Levite's job was to do some of the things that the priests didn't have time to do, and that would help him out. So maybe that last priest was busy, but the Levite's job then would be to say, well, the priest was busy. Let me help the priest by helping this man. Did the Levite help the man? No. He did the same thing the priest did. He walks around that guy, doesn't even give him the time of day. But then here comes a third man. Jesus says it is a Samaritan. A Samaritan is somebody from Samaria. But we have to understand in those days, the Jews and the Samaritans did not like each other. And really the reason is that the Jews didn't like the Samaritans. They were mean to the Samaritans. They thought the Samaritans weren't as good as the Jews. They thought they were not as important as the Jews. And so the Jews called the Samaritans a lot of mean names. We could talk about why that is, but that's another story for another day. But this Samaritan then would look at this Jewish man that was beat up and was laying there sore and without any money and without anybody to help him. And he could have thought, serves him right. He could have thought, you know, those Jews have been so mean to me my whole life. Oh, those Jews have always called me names. Oh, those Jews don't like people like me. He's getting what he deserves. And that Samaritan could have walked around him just like the priest and the Levite. But is that what he did? No. According to Jesus in Luke chapter 10, that Samaritan got down on the ground. He treated the wounds of this injured man. He took some olive oil and he poured it into his wounds. He took some wine, kind of like our peroxide, like maybe your mom might pour into your cuts today. And it stings a little bit, but it kills the germs and it would help those wounds heal. Then he made homemade bandages because he didn't have Band-Aids back then. He would take his own clothes and rip up part of his own clothes to make bandages to tie up and treat the wounds of that man. Then you know what he did. He helped him up. He put him on his own animal, probably a donkey, and he led that donkey to kind of like a hotel, an inn. And he said, look, put this man up in your room, and give him everything he needs. You give him room service, give him breakfast in bed. You make sure he gets everything he needs. And then he pulls out some money and he lays it on the table and he says, this should cover all of his expenses. And when I come back in a couple of weeks, if he needed anything else and this money didn't cover it, you let me know and I'll pay whatever else he needs when I come back through here. And then Jesus asked his listeners a question. He said, which one was a neighbor to that poor guy that got beat up? Was the priest a neighbor to him? Was the Levite a good neighbor? No. The Samaritan, the one that they least expected, acted like a real neighbor. And here's what Jesus said next. You go and do the same thing. In other words, guys, if we are believers in Jesus, we are to be like that Samaritan. Not like the priest. And the priest did a lot of good stuff for a lot of people, but he wasn't willing to get down and get his hands dirty to help out this poor man. Same with the Levite. Didn't want to get down on the ground and get his hands dirty, and so he kept going. But the Samaritan, he learned how to do what the Bible says, to love your neighbor as yourself. So we have an expression today. We talk about getting our hands dirty. We just don't want to get down and get our hands dirty so we don't get involved. But that Samaritan, he got his hands dirty. He got down off of his donkey. He treated the wounds of this man who was beat up. He spent his own money. He used his own time. He might have been late for wherever he was going, but he did all these things so that he could love his neighbor as himself. Jesus said, you go do the same thing. You go get your hands dirty for me, Jesus was saying. Hey, if you want to get those big juicy tomatoes, if you want those good hot boiled peanuts on a fall Saturday, if you want that sweet corn on the cob, you've got to get your hands dirty. And if you want to love your neighbor as yourself, if you want to be the kind of Christian that Jesus says learns how to be a good neighbor, then sometimes we have to get our hands dirty. I don't just mean going and playing in the dirt. I mean getting down and doing things that we might not like doing at the time, but in the end, we know it's worth it. In the end, there's going to be a big juicy tomato waiting for us if we're willing to get our hands dirty. And in the end, God will say to us, well done, my good and faithful servant, if we're willing to get our hands dirty for him. So let's go out and be a good neighbor for somebody today, and let's look for a way to get our hands dirty for Jesus.